Hi everybody, we're going to work on the lymphatic system. It's a very short chapter and we will move through this one pretty quickly. If you're following me, I'm in your course pack on page 62 and we'll just start with the functions of the lymphatic system. There's two major jobs here. One is to return escaped fluids to the cardiovascular system, and secondly, this system also plays a role in immunity. That is immune function that helps to protect us from foreign invaders. So the term lymph means that we have a type of fluid that includes escaped blood plasma. We also see excess interstitial fluid in the lymph. We also may find plasma proteins that escaped with the blood plasma into the interstitial space. And we may find white blood cells, but we should not be finding red blood cells or platelets in our lymph. So you may say, well, why do we have escaped blood plasma and blood cells like white blood cells in our lymph? Well, we have to go back and consider how these fluids got out of the cardiovascular system in the first place. In the previous chapter on blood vessels, we talked about hydrostatic pressure pushing fluids out of our capillaries and osmotic pressure pulling it back in at the venous end of the capillary. 90% of the fluids that are pushed out are reclaimed back at the venous end of our capillaries, but there's about 10% of those fluids that end up staying around in the interstitial space. These fluids do not need to remain in the interstitial space because they can cause edema, so they should be picked up and carried back to the cardiovascular system by our lymphatic vessels. So the escaped fluids, such as blood plasma and those escaped plasma proteins, that's how they get out. They get pushed out by way of hydrostatic pressure, and they're not able to be reabsorbed back because we're only getting back about 90% of what we push out. Lymph vessels are scattered loosely throughout the connective tissues of our bodies. They do stay fairly close to where we have fluids escaping the cardiovascular system, which, as you can imagine, is pretty much everywhere. And these lymph vessels also have cleaning stations called lymph nodes scattered throughout. Some of them you can feel. They're the ones in your neck and your armpit and groin areas, and then others are more deeply associated with the internal parts of your body. So they are colored green here so that we don't confuse them with red arteries or blue veins. That's typically the color you'll see on these models, is green for those lymphatic vessels. So lymph vessels are thin-walled. They are large, larger ones do have valves, and they are a low pressure and pumpless system. So whereas the cardiovascular system is sometimes called the circulatory system because fluids circulate around the body, this is actually not a circulatory system. We are not circulating lymph around the body. Instead, these vessels are closed-in, and that means that they are traveling with fluids in one direction only, and that is back toward the heart. So when I mean closed-in, this is what I mean. There is literally an end to the vessel, and the fluids that get in there are then trapped, and the fluid then flows back in one direction, and that is toward getting their way back toward the heart. So because this system is not including a pump, no heart here to help move this fluid back, this system relies on your physical activity and movements to help milk along this fluid in these lymphatic vessels. So you'll find that a lot of the same features that help to move blood along in our low pressured veins, those same features here help move along this pumpless low pressured system with lymph. Okay, so what are those aids? How do we help get lymph back to the heart? Muscular activity, we call that our muscular pump. So your physical activity will help move along the lymph toward the heart. Your breathing is called the respiratory pump. That too will help to move fluids from the lower pressure, higher pressure elsewhere in your body to the lower pressure in your thoracic cavity. There are also smooth muscles in some of our lymphatic vessel walls that help to contract and move along that lymph. But it really is a combined effort of your muscular activity, your breathing, and these smooth muscles that help to return lymph in this pumpless system back toward the heart. Here you can take a look at those closed-in capillaries. Keep in mind they are green in this picture, and they are scattered throughout this capillary network or capillary bed. These capillaries are there to pick up fluids from our own cardiovascular capillaries. Those fluids escape, and of course, about 10% of that fluid, or 3 liters per day, has to get carried into these lymphatic vessels. So imagine that these lymphatic capillaries are kind of like a subway train. When the subway train stops, the doors open, people get on board, and then the train doors shut. That's kind of the concept here. These are collagen fibers. You can see them hanging off right there. And they will attach to surrounding cells and tissues to prop these little doorways open. They call them mini valves. These little doorways stay open and allow fluid to travel into the lymphatic capillaries. When the capillaries become filled with lymph, those valves, of course, close, and that keeps the fluid inside. Now, fluid will travel in one direction, and that is back toward the heart. So, these lymphatic capillaries, we probably should say the word lymphatic in front to differentiate from those cardiovascular capillaries that serve a different purpose in our cardiovascular system. Here's another view of how these lymphatic capillaries are situated in cells and tissues. These little openings allow for fluids to easily travel in toward the low pressure inside the lymphatic capillary. Like I mentioned, once the fluid accumulates inside, those little capillary mini valves will close, trapping the fluid for its one-way pathway back toward the heart. So the fluid in the body all drains back toward the heart so it can rejoin circulation. But the fluid pathways are actually asymmetrical. So you'll notice here there's two large ducts on either side of the chest cavity. That's where that fluid is going to travel. So on the right side of the chest cavity, we have what's called a right lymphatic duct. And on the left side of the chest cavity, we have what's called a thoracic duct. And so it is to those two ducts, D-U-C-T, not the quack quack kind, that we're going to let this fluid travel back to the heart. Now, I should draw your attention to the bottom of your page. If there is a blockage in a lymphatic vessel, we are then unable to get that fluid back to the heart. That means the lymph might continue to accumulate in what space? It'll accumulate in that interstitial space, causing what condition? That causes edema. So unfortunately, if you're basically robbing the cardiovascular system of fluids, your cardiac output and blood pressure will then drop. So it's critical that we get this escaped fluid into the lymphatic vessels and then get it back toward the heart. If you take a moment to flip on over to page 63 with me, let's talk about the flow pattern that you see in this picture. The right side of the head, the right arm, and the right side of the thoracic cavity drain back into the right lymphatic duct and into the right subclavian vein. Okay, so an asymmetrical flow pattern here, just be aware of that. Notice, however, that both legs, the lower abdomen, left arm, left side of the thoracic cavity, and left side of the head, actually all of that fluid in the lymphatic system dumps back into a thoracic duct and into the left subclavian vein. You may recall those subclavian veins drain into the brachiocephalic veins. They in turn drain into the superior vena cava and back into the right atrium of the heart. Okay, so we're looking here at an asymmetrical flow pattern. Just keep in mind that this is not a symmetrical flow pattern, and all of this fluid travels in one direction, and that is back toward which organ? That is back toward the heart. Okay. So just another view here of these vessels. You know, sometimes when people have shunts put in for medication to be delivered, they take advantage of the fact that these jugular veins here join in with these subclavian veins and form this brachiocephalic vein that ends up here into this SVC. So they take advantage of that and place those shunts into this general area because that's where those thoracic and lymphatic ducts join blood flow and help that fluid get back toward the heart. All right, so just keep in mind, this is an asymmetrical flow pattern. Right side of the thorax, right arm, and right side of the head drain separately from the left side of the thorax, left arm, rest of the lower body. Okay, so just keep in mind there is an asymmetrical flow pattern here. Of course, all this fluid is aiming for the heart. We know the SVC dumps this fluid back into the right atrium. That helps us maintain normal cardiac output and normal blood pressure. Let's talk about lymph nodes for just a moment. I think of these as cleaning stations. They are scattered among your lymphatic vessels, and they help remove bacteria, viruses, tumor cells, and other things from your lymph. Why is it important that we clean this lymph? Well, where's that lymph going? Okay, so all lymph is going back toward the heart, and if you allow for, say, bacteria or viruses or cancer cells even to make their way to the heart, where can these items then travel? Of course, everywhere, right? So we're looking for a way to stop these items from traveling and becoming systemic in nature, meaning we don't want these items to be able to travel to your entire body. So for that reason, the lymph nodes also contain a specialized type of white blood cell. They're called lymphocytes. You might recall those from an earlier chapter. These lymphocytes can produce antibodies to help fight against foreign invaders and our own cancer cells if they are in fact in circulation. I just want to mention to you that lymph nodes can become a secondary site for cancer. If they become overwhelmed by, say, cancer cells, cancer can reside there and form a secondary type of cancer. Painful lymph nodes are ones that are probably cleaning out bacteria or viruses. You may have had these if you have a sinus infection around your head and neck area. The ones to be concerned about are the swollen lymph nodes that are not painful. Those should be checked. Lymph nodes are scattered among all of our lymphatic vessels. You can actually feel them loosely embedded in connective tissue around your neck. Those are called the cervical lymph nodes. Under your chin, back of your neck, you may have had them become sore if you had a really awful head cold. Axillary lymph nodes are in the armpit. You can probably feel those. And where are inguinal lymph nodes? They're in the groin area. Okay, so these are not the only sets of lymph nodes. They are scattered among our lymphatic vessels, and they are helping to clean that lymph as it travels through. So as lymph flows back to the heart, the lymph in the legs travels through the inguinal lymph nodes. The lymph in the arms travel through the axillary lymph nodes in the armpit area, and the lymph in the head travels through the cervical lymph nodes. Okay, so like I said, that's not the only sets that we have. We do have them scattered elsewhere in the body that are used to clean and remove bacteria, viruses, or even cancer cells from that lymph before it returns back to the blood flow. Here's a look at some lymphocytes inside these lymph nodes. Keep in mind they help to form antibodies, and they help to launch an immune attack against invaders that may be traveling through these lymph nodes. So take a look at the lymph node here. We've got afferent lymphatic vessels bringing in lymph to be cleansed by the lymph node. We have efferent here with an E, lymph nodes or lymph vessels leaving the lymph node. Let's just pay attention to the number of vessels coming in versus going out. I count 4 afferent vessels coming in, and I count 2 efferent vessels leaving. Think of this like you would a toll road. If you've ever traveled a toll road, they want to collect your money, so you'll notice the toll road may expand up to 8, 10, 15 lanes wide. Once they collect your money, the lanes then narrow back down. So they don't want to make it difficult for you to travel into the toll booth to collect your money. They don't care once they've collected your money if it's difficult to get back out. So the choke point here is not the ability to come into the lymph node. There's 4 lanes here coming in. However, by only having 2 lanes leaving means that it's more difficult for the fluid to escape. The purpose in this is to slow the flow of lymph through the lymph node and allow these lymph nodes the opportunity to cleanse the lymph traveling through. So there are macrophages that can eat items here. Remember, those are large white blood cells. And of course, lymphocytes, we've talked about those already, are also here to help build immunity and form antibodies against these foreign invaders. There are also threads here called trabecula. You can see some of them here that create these little chamber-like rooms, and that helps to trap these foreign invaders in a specific single room. That way, the entire lymph node does not become infected. Only a portion may be battling, say, bacteria, while the rest of that lymph node can stay clean and healthy. But if they do swell, which they may do if you have a bacterial or viral infection, just know that they are cleaning that whatever's traveling through. So painful swollen lymph nodes are usually a sign that those lymph nodes are cleaning. So just another look here at a lymph node. You can even see these little trabeculae forming these little chambers in here. So the last part of this chapter is just simply a brief overview of some lymphoid organs. Lymphoid means lymph-like. Okay, so these organs may play roles elsewhere in the body. A lot of these organs contain lymphocytes or macrophages because they do play some role in immunity. Okay, so just keep that in mind that we have some B cells and T cells here at play that help to fight and form immunity against foreign invaders. Let's talk first about the spleen, which is a membrane-encapsulated organ found on the left side of the abdominopelvic cavity. I mentioned that it's membrane encapsulated for a reason. Think of this organ as being wrapped with a type of membrane like saran wrap. If it were to rupture or split open, there's no way for that membrane to heal, so that's why people who have had a spleen rupture have to have it removed. Now, the spleen is a filtering organ, kind of like a sponge. Red blood cells that travel through here become trapped by the spongy tissue of the spleen. They are removed from circulation, and some of the products of that breakdown process are stored here. People who happen to have a spleen removed, this function is now taken up by the liver. So on your worksheet, you'll notice that I've underlined some key terms. The spleen cleanses blood of red blood cells, debris, foreign matter, bacteria, and viruses. Some of the breakdown products are stored here. And of course, that's why we sometimes call the spleen a blood reservoir. And some platelets are stored here as well. So if in case of emergency, maybe a person is having a hemorrhage, the spleen can donate some of these platelets and blood cell products to circulation. Let's now talk about the thymus gland. It is found in the chest, overlying the heart. You'll notice right here it is, under the sternum, not to be confused with the thyroid gland, which is a little further up around the neck area. It forms a bow tie shaped structure around the trachea. So we know the thymus from our earlier discussions on endocrine system. What is the name of the hormone that the thymus gland makes? It makes one very similar sounding called thymosin. Okay, and that one helps to program T cells, which are a specific type of lymphocyte during your adolescent years. By the time you're into your late teenage years, that thymus gland will atrophy, meaning it has dried up, and therefore the job to program T cells shifts elsewhere to another T location, and that would be to your tonsils. This image is kind of funny. It's a publisher image. It has since been corrected, but there are not, in fact, 6 sets of tonsils. Here there's 5. You have a set of adenoids at the back of the nasopharynx region. You have a pair of palatine tonsils at the back of your throat. If you say ah, you can see those oval-shaped palatine tonsils at the back of your throat on either side. And then the lingual tonsils are found at the base of the tongue. You would have to stick your tongue out incredibly far, perhaps too far, for you to be able to see those linguals at the base of your tongue. So these tonsils are there to help remove microbes, such as bacteria and viruses, in the air that's entering in through your nose and through your mouth areas. So like I mentioned, T cells may be programmed here after the thymus gland is atrophied in the late teenage years. You can also see the spleen right here, and you can see the thymus gland here as well. And down below you see these little tiny things around the intestines. These are called payers or Peyer's patches, and they're also part of our malt system. So tonsils here and these patches are forming in basically mucosa tissue, and we call them mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. So tonsils and these patches are found in that particular set of tissues. So here you can see these patches. They are lymphoid tissue, and it is their job to help again fight bacteria before it gets into the bloodstream. We haven't yet talked about the digestive system, but we will learn later on that the intestines are a great location for absorbing nutrients, and unfortunately bacteria can make its way into the bloodstream as well. So these patches, just like tonsils, are helping to prevent the movement of bacteria into our bloodstream. Just a moment to spend some time on disorders of the lymphatic system. This is not in your course pack, just for fun. You've probably heard of the bubonic plague or the black plague, transmitted by fleas, and of course bacteria is involved in that life cycle. This is a bubo or a swollen lymph node here. So back in the day when people had the plague, this is what was swollen all over their bodies, and unfortunately they died of a bacterial infection if they died of the plague. There are still cases of plague around in the world. We have not eradicated this disease yet. This is called lymphedema. If a person has blockages in the lymphatic vessels, we know that about 10% of the fluids and protein cannot get back into the capillary that must be transported by your lymphatic system. Unfortunately, if those fluids cannot get transported by the lymphatic system, they can cause edema, and that's exactly what we're looking at here. So this is not fat, this is in fact fluid that is accumulated in the interstitial space causing edema, literally lymphedema, because the lymphatic system is at fault here. This is a mastectomy-induced set of lymphedema in this woman's left arm. You'll notice in her left arm she's got incredible amounts of swelling. So perhaps she had lymph vessels and lymph nodes removed. And of course, if that's the case, then it's very difficult for the fluids that have escaped the cardiovascular system to make their way back toward the heart. They can give you a pressurized sleeve to wear that helps to move the fluids back, but otherwise this would be a very painful condition when those fluids get trapped in the interstitial space. Be thankful we don't live in an area of the world where this particular worm is common, Wucheria. It is the cause of elephantiasis. You can see in this region of the world we have Wucheria common, and let me show you the life cycle of this worm. This particular worm travels in a life cycle between mosquitoes, nasty old mosquitoes, right? And the larvae of this worm travel partly through the life cycle of the mosquito and partly through the life of a human being, a human adult. So here you can see that these worms can get into the body. They block the lymphatic vessels, and unfortunately that means those fluids that are in the interstitial space cannot get back to the heart. So this is elephantiasis. It's kind of like lymphedema, but it's caused by a worm that blocks those vessels. So again, this is not fat, this is water that accumulates and proteins found outside the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems in the interstitial space. So unfortunately, until you kill that worm, these people are going to have this kind of blockage and this accumulation of fluid here. So you can see one leg is affected by the Wucheria worm, the other was not. And unfortunately, these worms can also block areas of the groin. And that's what you see here. These are scrotum filled with fluid, and unfortunately that means the fluid has made their scrotum swell. And that is all due to that Wucheria worm that has blocked the return of fluids, even from the scrotum and testes, going back toward the heart.